Hello everyone, this is a quick online lecture which will provide some feedback on the work that you presented to us last week for Assessment 3 form. What I'd like you to do is to consider this feedback as you're progressing your work towards Assessment 4 resolution. And what we're going to talk a little bit about now is what was successful in Assessment 3, what was less successful in Assessment 3, and what you might now do with this feedback. So what was successful? First of all, we felt that your form making was quite successful. And form making not for the sake of spatial gymnastics and kind of shape creation, but rather form making and spatial decisions that responded quite sensitively to the project brief. So remember that the project brief asks you to respond to the program of a micro-dwelling and a linked urban intervention, users, so Ushio, Noriko, and the public who might be using the intervention, and then the site in Kingsford. So if we look at some of these examples here, you'll see that these students have responded to various aspects of that brief. The first one on the left we see is looking at the way that light moves across the site and the way that light might enter into the interior. It's looking at contrasting quite dramatically to the geometries of the existing site and perhaps playing into the way that Ushio and Noriko might be open to these kind of forms that are maybe what we would see less of in Sydney, in the context of Sydney. If we have a look at the example in the middle, this student again is looking at light coming in various ways and also at view, so projecting outwards and upwards, and then at a form which sort of emerges out of the geometries of the existing site and hovers above that back roof. So again, there's an engagement heavily with sight. And then the last example, I think, really shows a crafting of space and of 3D with great consideration to having quite memorable spatial moments throughout this very small micro apartment. The second component that we felt was very well done was your model making. And this was demonstrated in the site plans, which were formed in various ways. We can see the example on the left is etched into plywood, and then the model itself is made in boxboard. It's a working model, but clearly and evocatively communicated. And then other students experimented with other materials. So we can see on the top right a clear differentiation between the existing building and the proposed new forms through a different differentiation in materials. The inclusion of people really helps us to understand the scale of the forms. So effective visual communication strategies in the model. And then if we have a look at the example on the bottom right, I think this is a good demonstration that we've seen really successful model making throughout the term, and it's important for you to bring all of these process models in your final presentation because they really help to clearly illustrate the thinking and the development of your thinking over the term. The final component that we felt was successful was your engagement in the peer review process on the day. Despite tiredness and nerves before presentations, you were all really engaged in the process of trying on these behavioural hats and really talking quite critically through one another's schemes. This has been demonstrated by the cohort throughout the term, and I encourage you to continue to do this for the remaining weeks and as you move into second year. So if we think about the exercise that you did last week, it can be really helpful even when you're on your own and reflecting on your own work to think, well, if I looked at this from the big picture perspective, what works and what doesn't? And what about if I zoom in and look at fine grained kind of nitty gritty detail? What if I'm playing that super glue role and I start to link together the ideas that I've been working on into one narrative? And what if I stop for a second and think about this completely left field from a completely different perspective? How might I critique it? What might I change? What would I do differently in the coming weeks as we move into materiality? So we're now going to talk about what was less successful in assessment 3 as you move towards assessment 4. What we found is that although there was good form making demonstrated in response generally to the project brief, the visual communication of the apartment detail was less apparent, particularly in the drawings. So by that I mean you need to communicate to us not just the overall forms, but the detail of the functions. So where do you eat? Do you eat in the apartment? Where do you sleep? Do you sleep in the apartment? Where do you wash? Where do you wash your body? Where do you wash food? Where do you wash clothes? Where does the cat get washed? And the way to communicate that is by showing us joinery, so benches, tables, chairs, perhaps cupboards, as well as fixtures, so basins, taps, sinks. You can also show us more detail as we move through the weeks on your spatial decisions through line weights, so varied line weights. Which walls are really thick and are homes to shelves, for example, or beds that fold in and out? Which walls are more thin? Which floors are thick? Which floors are thin? Where are the doors? Where are the openings? For windows, what type of windows are they? How do they open? How do the doors open and close? These here are examples of drawings, so a plan and an axonometric that communicate the level of detail that we need to be seeing right now. I do want to stress that you don't need to be using Rhino if you don't want to. We're happy to see hand drawing done. You might also think about hand drawing and then inputting the JPEG files to Photoshop and then adding rendering and people and light in Photoshop. You don't have to use Rhino. The second component that we found was less successful in assessment 3 was your programming of the urban intervention. And by that I mean the function of the urban intervention. So what the brief asks is that the urban intervention is for either eating, and it's for you to interpret what eating might mean. That can be physically eating, might be preparing food, it might be storing food, sleeping, or washing. What we saw was some interesting spatial propositions for seating areas, but often these seating areas didn't incorporate one of those functions. So what we're really trying to question in this project is how we might utilize public space to support some of the functions of the apartment, but also provide amenity and opportunity for social interaction in the public spaces of our cities. Putting some of these traditionally private functions out onto the street, it really asks us to rethink these functions, but also the role of public street spaces. And that's part of the goal of this studio. So we just ask you to engage in that component of the brief and to give it some more consideration in your assessment 4 presentation. So the work that we can see here, we can see that it's a bench for sitting, but also there's potentially room for preparing food, and there's a basin and some taps. So we start to think about these functions of eating, sleeping, or washing, and how we might communicate these. We appreciate that this was the first time that you have presented to us perspective views of your space. And what we ask you to think about for assessment 4 is how you might capture the really key and great parts of your space. You can, and so rather than just superfluous details or corner details that don't really tell us much about the nature of your spatial propositions, you can do this in Rhino, but you can also do it by taking photos of models. And this student here took photos of models and then put them into Photoshop and played with the light levels and introduced people using JPEGs. So that might be another approach to how you can create perspective views. What I did last week is just went around and took a few photos with my iPhone of some of your models, and it really demonstrated to me that for assessment 4, you might be able to capture light and materiality by photographing these models. So there were some really great models where when I looked into them, I could imagine myself experiencing this space. You can see in the image on the right that adding a person also helps us to understand the scale of the spaces that you're proposing. Finally, we would like you to consider how you craft all of the details of your presentation with care. So what does that mean? That means thinking about things like labels, page sizes and being consistent in your page sizes, aligning drawings and aligning pages on the walls, thinking about the color and the position of your pins, thinking about the kind of font that you use. We appreciate that the last assessment was a working assessment, so it was in process, but even for these in-process assessments, you need to think about clarity and about selling your scheme to us in an evocative way. This doesn't mean that you need to spend a lot of time on these small details, but it does mean that you need to think about them and to consider how you craft these elements so that they are not distracting to us as the audience. So an example here is this boxboard model. Again, it could be more refined for assessment 4, but for assessment 3, it is what we were looking for. We focus on the form of the model, and we're provided some clarity around the intent of the model through a very simple label that is being typed and printed. So, we've talked about what was successful, we've talked about what was less successful. What I would ask you to do now is to take 5 or 10 minutes, think critically about this feedback and write some notes in terms of what might be quite pertinent to you and to your scheme. And then write some notes with regard to how you might apply this feedback in the work that you're developing now. As you start to think about and develop assessment 4, remember to keep this feedback at the front of your mind. Really look forward to seeing you all tomorrow. Please do not hesitate to contact me if you have any questions on any of this feedback. Thank you.